let's take a little look at the actual grading process, because it's one thing to talk about mutilated currency. Let's look at it. Here you go. Here's a grade 5. These are the worst. Grade 1. See, it looks pretty much like money, and you could see that, yeah, you're not going to be able to put that in any cash machine, but there's no doubt about that. Almost the whole bill is there. 2, 3, 4. This is almost ash. You have a big area here where there's almost nothing left, and that is why it's graded 5, which is going to take the longest time, and you can imagine how difficult it is to go through something like that without having the whole thing fall apart. So it's a very, very challenging thing. Interesting note, the one thing that has survived pretty well intact is the color-changing ink. So I don't know it's designed to go through an inferno, but you can rest assured if the big one ever happens, they say there's only 2 things that will survive, and that's the cockroaches and our color-shifting ink. All right, let's talk about a close-up. There you go. So imagine having that land on your desk, and you're told, figure that out. How much money is that? Those examiners are very, very skillful folks, and it takes a long time till you can actually tackle one of these grade 5 cases. It's a learning curve. You start off on grade 1 and work your way up. Makes sense. This is what happens to water-damaged currency. And again, here we go. See the 1, it looks pretty good, just a little stained. 2, looking worse. 3, 4, until you get this. And that's basically a solid clump. What do they do when it comes in? Depends if it's still wet or not. If it's wet, they carefully try to tease it apart. If it's dried and it's just a solid mass, they actually have to wet it again. They put moisture very, very carefully to it so that there's enough moisture so that they try to go through layer by layer by layer and figure out how much is still there. It's a painstaking operation. If you're wondering what sort of person becomes a mutilated currency examiner, not me. I think it's the kind of person that likes working on jigsaw puzzles, or the people who put together those sailboats inside a bottle, that sort of thing. I would not have the patience for that. And I'm a lawyer, so I don't like to help people anyway. Okay, here we go. Buried currency. As I said, good things do not happen to money when it's been buried. This has just started to deteriorate, but it's pretty recognizable. Here it gets solidified. Look at the 4 and the 5. It's almost unrecognizable as money. I mean, all sorts of things leach from the soil. Moisture gets in there, fungus gets in there, and it no longer even looks like money. So they have to work very, very hard for these level 5 cases. That's a close-up. Anyone want to give this a shot? See how much we've got there. And shredded currency. Every now and again, money gets through the shredder, which is not a good idea either. We grade that, but as you can imagine, it's graded based on how many notes. 1 to 3 notes, 4 to 8 notes. If you look at grade 5, what we have here, try to put that together. Reminds me of the game Pick-Up Sticks, but except much more difficult. And those are extremely painstaking cases. And it amazes me that anyone could take that and actually figure out how much money was there. But they do. There you go. There's a close-up of what it looks like after a shredder and currency come together. Now, what do we have there? Notice the brown tinge to that mud? That's the heavy clay soil of Louisiana, and that's what happened after Hurricane Katrina. So I wouldn't know that. They told me this was a Katrina example, but that is what happens after the floods. So as I said, we typically get a flood of submissions after there are a lot of floods because people store their work in their basements. We have a special program in existence right now where we're expediting any claims that come in from our various disaster areas. Interestingly, we haven't gotten many from Texas or Florida or Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands yet. we're offering to give them expedited treatment because those people have been through enough, and it is their life savings in many cases. If they mark that it's from the flood zones, we do try to give expedited treatment. They're getting very few cases. Where are they getting a lot of cases from? California, from the fire zones, Sonoma, Napa Valley. It's interesting. That is coming in a lot of volume, and we're hearing a lot from those folks. So I don't know if it's a factor of the Puerto Rico and Texas and Florida situations just being worse, and those people have other things to worry about than their mutilated currency. Or maybe if you're in Napa, you just have a lot more money to begin with, so that's the situation there. But we are getting a lot of fire damage money coming in from those zones. Now, what are the actual tools that they work with? As you can see, it's an extremely high-tech situation. They use the same sort of tools that you would be able to see 75 years ago. They just pry it apart, do their best using a loop or a magnifying glass, X-Acto knives, tweezers. Up there, that's an interesting thing. Anyone have a guess? What is that? Exactly. What the gentleman said is you put the money on it. Put a little more formally, that's a grid in order to determine the percentage of the currency that's still there. Remember I mentioned one of the things they look for, do we have a majority of the bill? Well, they actually lay out those fragments on that grid, and they see how many of those squares are filled in. And based on that, they know if they're dealing with most of the currency or not. Pretty low-tech operation, just a lot of skill and individual determination. Now, this is unfit currency, and basically that's a grade below mutilated currency, and we pretty much send it back to the Federal Reserve or to submitters and say, this isn't mutilated currency, you can spend this or you can bring it to your bank, and the bank will send it through the Federal Reserve System. You don't need highly trained examiners to work with this money because it's pretty clear how much is there. Now, I mentioned to you that we get some rip-offs and some scam attempts, which is going to happen anytime you have a government program that is giving out money. A certain percentage of the population will try to steal it. It's an ironclad rule. So, how does that happen with us? People sometimes intentionally mutilate money. They do it sometimes as a form of literally money laundering dirty money from criminal enterprises. Other folks have attempted schemes where they're submitting X amount of money, but it really was a lesser amount, and they're trying to get extra money. Sometimes they actually intentionally mutilate the money in a way that they think that they're going to convince us that it has to be a higher value. Basically, one of the famous schemes that we are very well aware of, and I'll be as general as I have to be so I don't give any advanced knowledge to the bad guys, because I know this will be out on YouTube, and while it will not be competing with Beyonce or Justin Bieber in terms of hits, we still know it's going to be out there. There has been a scheme that we have uncovered over the years where people basically try to take two bills, cut them up in a certain way, and submit it as if it's three bills, and make a 33% profit. So what we are trying to do is to cut those kind of schemes off at the knees. Now, how did it actually happen that those regulations were changed? I came on board in 2013 as the new chief counsel at BEP, and like any decent lawyer, I wanted to know, what does my client really do? So I took the standard tour, went behind the scenes, looked at all the different parts of BEP, and was extremely impressed by everything that I saw these mutilated currency examiners do. I asked them, what exactly are you working on? I went to different desks, and people would show me times where an individual would submit counterfeit money mixed in with legitimate money, with the idea being they think that they're going to get it all paid. Or sometimes, maybe they were fooled themselves by someone. It all depends. As a fraud prosecutor, I can tell you, what are we looking for? I spent years prosecuting healthcare fraud. It's the same concept. You look for a pattern, and it's one thing to have one or two counterfeit bills that someone might have had slip to them. They put it in their strong box. The strong box gets flooded. We get it. It's very different when we get a submission where 1 out of every 3 bills is counterfeit, and they're arranged that way. Clearly, someone is trying to submit it in, mixing in bad money with good money. We had a $4 million submission from a bank that contained a lot of counterfeit money, and it contained a lot of 2-for-3 scams and other kinds of scams. And it also happened to be hitting my desk as a legal case because we did what was called a forfeiture action. And what does that mean? The government actually goes out affirmatively and sues and seizes the money, saying, this is bad money. This is from illegal sources. We are forfeiting this money. In a case like that, it takes a lot of legal work, and the burden of proof is on the government to show that this is, in fact, bad money. And the other side has a chance to prove that it's not, but the burden is on us. Well, that takes a lot of time and effort. A lot of federal agencies have to get involved and all agree that we're going to forfeit this money. At the same time, our mutilated currency examiners have to plow through all of it and see how much do we have here, and that was $4 million worth. And I heard about these other instances where people would occasionally try these scams. Our examiners would have to go through that money, pick out the bad, and send them back the stuff that was good. And I said, well, what is wrong with that picture? Why are we even allowing that to happen? Why are we facilitating that? So I decided to change the rules of the game because we're doing this service for legitimate people. We're trying to help Antilles out there, and a few scam artists are trying to take advantage of us. So what are we going to do? We're going to change the rules so that they not only are deterred from doing it, if they do it, they get penalized. In short, what happens now is if you submit bad, intentionally mutilated money, you're not going to get it back. If you intentionally submit counterfeit and it's part of a scheme and you've hidden it within legitimate submissions, not only do you not get paid for the counterfeit, we obviously never do that, all of the legitimate money that you've sent in, we don't return it. We keep it as evidence or we destroy it. So that really is a huge disincentive for anyone to try and pull these kind of scams. Now, these new rules that I'm about to go through, they were rushed in on an emergency basis. After I was there for about a half a year, I was working on this project, and we put it in high gear. Why? Because we heard from the intelligence community, and we work closely with the Secret Service, that there was a scheme in Asia. There was a criminal organization that was in the process of harvesting those ribbons off of the $100 bill, those blue security ribbons, and on a systematic basis, taking them off, storing them. What were they going to do with them? Well, our belief and our intelligence was telling us that they were going to print counterfeit bills that were halfway decent, put the security ribbon on those counterfeits, and you would have a really good counterfeit because it would have the primo security feature on it, that very high-tech security feature that I talked about with the hundreds and the bells and the lenses and everything moving across. That would pass muster with most folks because they look at that primo security feature right off the bat. Now, what would they then do with the hundreds that they had taken the security feature? Well, obviously, they would send it into BEP and they would have it redeemed. Well, we changed the rules so that even if you have an almost intact bill, but it's missing a security feature on a consistent basis, we're not going to redeem it. And that scheme was cut off at the knees. They stopped it because we put those rules through on an emergency basis. If you think about it, obviously, there's no sense in ruining a $100 bill to create a counterfeit $100 bill if you don't get the real $100 bill redeemed. At most, it's an even swap, and it's not even going to be that. So that scheme was completely stopped. And once in a while, government is ahead of the curve and actually does things the right way. So when you hear all that government bashing, think of the examiners. Don't think of me. Think of those examiners who are doing everything they can. So that's kind of the backstory of how we came to change these rules and to try to make the playing field much more favorable for the government. Let's zero in on some of them. We basically tell people right up front, and none of these are secret. You know, this is nothing like Animal House, where they had double secret probation, if any of you have seen that. Some people refer to the Bible. Some people, pardon me? Yeah. Well, there was a really bad fraternity, and it was put on double secret probation, which meant that they were never told that they were on probation. So it was a good way to catch them. And yeah, my cultural references are Animal House and Seinfeld. So if you're looking for Bible quotes or Shakespeare, you'll have to look elsewhere. Anyway, what we said here was that we're not going to give any redemption at all if there's any pattern of intentional mutilation or any attempt to defraud the United States. So that's broad language. What we tell people up front, in those instances, the entire submission will be destroyed or retained for evidence. We'll call in the Secret Service, we'll call in law enforcement. If we think it's a good case for prosecution, that's where that money's going to go. If it's too small, if it's only $1 or $2, for instance, but it appears to have been intentionally mutilated, and we look for certain patterns, certain badges of fraud, as we call it as prosecutors. That I won't go into detail here, but believe me, there are things the examiners look for, and if it looks like it's intentionally mutilated, it's not going to get paid. So that's put right up front in the rules so that people understand that. Any submission that looks like it's intended to further any criminal scheme. What does that mean? If we think it's part of, let's say, a drug syndicate that is literally laundering its dirty money, but running it through us as a way to do it, we're just not going to redeem it. We don't have to go through that cumbersome process that I said before about forfeiting it, or we file suit against the money in effect, and we have to prove it. We've just told people up front, don't submit this money if it's part of a criminal scheme. And if it is, you're not going to get it back. If there's any material misrepresentation of facts, that's where that note comes in, that cover note that we ask for everyone to do. We look very carefully. Does it make sense? Does this appear to be a story that's consistent with what happened to the currency? I mean, an obvious case would be someone says, you know, this money was flooded, and you look at it, there's no water damage, but it looks like it was buried. You know, there's a host of things that we can look for that would indicate that the story just doesn't make sense. And if we see those kind of stories, we're not going to redeem it. Now, anything that we see in a submission that contains counterfeit currency. So I gave you the example before. If we get a submission of 200 bills that are all mutilated, and we see the counterfeit money is 1 out of every 3 bills, literally in that order, you're not going to get the counterfeits paid, and you're not going to get the rest of the money paid either. So again, huge deterrence. And if you're wondering what effect did it have, remember I told you we were getting $4 million cases. We were getting a number of cases every year that indicated intentional mutilation, intentional schemes and scams. They're getting virtually nothing. Since these new rules have been put in place and the word has gotten out, the fraud attempts have dropped to the floor. There are essentially none now. So I would never say none, because there's always someone who's going to still try it or hasn't heard about these rules, but there are virtually none of them now. Another safeguard that we've put in is that submission of $500 or more has to have a bank account number, and we pay them back through the bank with an electronic payment. Why did we do that? What's the safety aspect of that? Well, in the United States at least, and we do require it to be an American bank, you have to submit photo ID when you open a bank account. They have to know who you are and either a tax ID number or a social security number. So we know who the customer is. Remember, someone says they're Aunt Tilly, but are they really Aunt Tilly? Well, if it's more than $500, we have a bank account and we have a person that we can attribute it to. So again, that discourages the majority of the scammers, because let's face it, most of them are going to be submitting more than $500. If you're a big-time drug dealer, if you're a fraud scammer, it's probably not worth your time and effort to do anything smaller than that. Whereas for average submitters, there are a lot of people who submit less than $500. We literally do get submissions of a single dollar bill that's been mutilated. I don't, understand it. I mean, it's 49 cents to mail it into us. Wait at least a few months to get back your $1 check. But people do it, and we get the $1 submissions every now and again. We also look carefully to see if it's an example of structuring. Does anyone know what structuring is? Okay. In the world of white-collar crime, one of the safeguards our banking system has is that any deposit of $10,000 or more has to be reported to the IRS, so that everybody who is submitting a lot of money into the banking system, the government knows about it. And typically there's no problem, because if it's legitimate, it shouldn't be an issue. Every once in a while, the bad guys try to fly below the radar. And what they do is, well, I'm not going to submit anything more than $10,000, but they put in 20 submissions of $9,000 each. That's called structuring, where they're trying to stay just below the radar. Well, we view it the same way, too. If someone is trying to structure their submissions in such a way to avoid getting scrutiny, we look for that, too. So, in general, be honest, and you'll do fine. Here's what we warn people about. We tell them right up front, it's in the federal regulations, the director can provide any information about a questionable submission to law enforcement. So if you're sending it in here, and it's not completely kosher, which is another legal term, meaning not following all the rules, you have to take into account the risk that we'll be sending it to the Secret Service or to the Inspector General's office. Anyone who mutilates currency, if you intentionally rip up a dollar bill, so any of those videos that you see of the rappers burning money, they're committing a crime if it's real money in the video. It's a misdemeanor, so, you know, if 6 months in jail doesn't faze you, then go ahead and do it. But it is a misdemeanor. Anyone who files a false claim with us, that's a felony, though. And those are the provisions that would apply. 287, 18 U.S.C. 287, one of the famous fraud provisions. Basically, any false claim is punishable by up to 5 years imprisonment. 1341 is mail fraud. As a prosecutor, we used to have a saying, when in doubt, charge mail fraud, because it covers everything. That's also a 5-year felony. And you could be held civilly liable. We could actually sue you for all the time and the effort that our examiners had to go through in going through your fraudulent submission. You owe us money, and we can get civil penalties against you.